such. No one, including the United States, wants to run around trying to nip every possible threat in the bud. That would be an impossible way to conduct your foreign policy. One is always dealing with a finite number of soldiers and a finite, not infinite budget. One must triage the threats, and it will be only a very few that will rise to the level that might justify prevention. So in conclusion, not bad. I wanted to end about this time, so we had room for questions. Just war thinking has many strengths. It is normative without generating a set of unyielding Kantian legalisms. It is prudent without falling into crude realpolitik. It speaks to a general yearning for a world in which people are treated with minimal decency. It recognizes both necessity and responsibility. Thus, preemptive and preventive use of force, as refracted through just war thinking, will display a greater measure of gravity, being the result of serious moral reasoning than conclusions arrived at using various shortcuts of either a narrowly legalistic or a crudely reductionistic sort. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Well, we have time for questions, and that gives us time for everyone to have a bit of coffee before the panel on this subject, in which I will no doubt be instructed on where I have gone wrong. But maybe you want to instruct me right now. So, Jim?
Thanks, Jean. That was very nice, and I appreciate the points you raised. In my judgment, a lot of the difficulty in thinking morally about the matter of the use of force these days is connected to the legal effort to identify rightful use of armed force as response to aggression, to an armed attack in the language of the UN. Do you have any thoughts on the effort that is underway in the International Criminal Court to take the definition of aggression from the mid-1960s and make it the basis of a legal position for judgment within the court?
Well, Jim, you probably know more about the details of this than I do, but let me just say something that won't surprise anyone who just listened to this paper, namely that I'm rather wary of the direction that much legal or legalistic thinking takes in this area, especially where occasions for war are concerned. The worry being that once you encode things in law in a certain way, set them down in that matter, that the question then overwhelmingly, when such occasions may arise where consideration of the use of force is concerned, overwhelmingly then will be focused on the specific legalities of it. And as I said in my paper, the legal and the ethical need not mesh at every point. That there are all sorts of things in this world that the sort of grid of legal codes misses or cannot account for. And when we attempt to account for them, I think we narrow the universe of ethical argument, and we tend to fall into one of the two sort of dominant modalities of thinking, either, as I said, sort of Kantian categorical imperatives, sort of Kantianism, or utilitarianisms of one sort or the other. So that concerns me. Now, you'll have more to say about this, I'm sure, but that would be one of my concerns. I don't think that you can stipulate the occasions in a way that is exhaustive. And when you start to move in a highly legal direction, there's a tendency to assume that you can. That is to, if this is making sense to you, Jim, that is that you can sort of control the universe of possibility and reduce it to this set of considerations that will apply no matter what the occasion and no matter what the issues. Now, I may have this all wrong. You may think there's a lot more flexibility and nuance than there is in these attempts, but that's my general concern. And that concern was only underscored in many of the debates about the Iraq War. And as I indicated, I hope I made it clear, there are very strong arguments against that war. But I think that the more narrow legal arguments were not among them. So that would be the general approach I would take before I would get down to brass tacks about the specifics, a kind of wariness about those sorts of efforts. I think also, let me add one other thing, and that is, it seems to me that the legalization issue, or moving in a direction where you try to develop this highly legal grid and you can sort of check off what's legal or illegal and that suffices, especially if that's tied to notions of culpability and possible criminal culpability, you can wind up criminalizing what are essentially political decisions. Political decisions taken in good faith or on the basis of reasonable evidence. We may disagree with these decisions. We may think they're wrong. We may think that, we may even think they're disastrous, but there are ways that we have to deal with that. And I think that this, the possibility of criminalizing political activity and political decisions is, we should be quite wary of that. So that would be the general approach I would take. Yes?
Professor, I'd like to take you back to the moral argument for intervening in Iraq in 2003. You'll recognize from my accent I'm one of your American partners in that venture. Amongst the moral arguments regularly used by President Bush and Prime Minister Tony Blair were things like protect the innocent, use of chemical weapons in Halabja, massacre of the Marsh Arabs, these moral arguments. My concern is that in 2002-03, when they were raised, those incidents took place in 1988, at the time when the US and the UK would not even allow the Security Council to censure Iraq for gassing the Kurds, because he was the good guy. And then in 1991, the US and the UK had military personnel very close by when the Marsh Arabs were killed, and we watched it happen. And I think it's a bit, how can I say, we have a phrase in Scotland, there's a brass neck. It's a bit cheeky or a bit inappropriate for Bush and Blair to wheel out these old arguments when it suited them 14, 13 years later.
Well, they weren't in charge then.
But they still wheeled out the arguments.
Well, all right, I have two kinds of comments to make to that. The first has to do with the cheekiness, and the second has to do with the general argument about protecting the innocent, and as it relates to past horrors. On the cheekiness front, it seems to me that it's really not a very strong argument to say, well, back in 19 whatever, you know, this guy was your ally because you were trying to sort of, you know, use Iraq against Iran, so on and so forth. So how dare you at this point take a different position? It strikes me, to the extent that we did not protest at the time or take any measures, including censure, when some of these horrible things were happening, is in fact something that should be lamented and criticized as it happened then. But surely, to the extent that we did not act in any way that indicated our general repulsion at what was going on, do we not then bear an even greater responsibility to do something about this when we can? That is to say, it seems to me that one's responsibility increases, that rather than washing your hands of it and saying, well, in the past we did thus and so, so you know, we dare not do anything now. I don't think that's a terribly strong argument, because one might look back and say, you know what, we bear some degree of moral responsibility for what this regime is all about and what it has done, and we need to, in part, make some amends for our past mistakes or misdeeds in that regard. So